So Professor Arturo is heading the IMD World Competitiveness Center. I've watched you rigorously throughout my plane back from Bahrain to Dubai, and I wanted to look at some trigger points. You don't have many. So I would start off with asking you the questions directly. For Professor Arturo, is data-driven behavior a myth? We'll start off with that and we'll ease our way through the questions.
So it is not a myth in the sense that data has to be understood as a new asset in the new economy. And it means that actually can benefit companies and can also benefit countries at the end of the day. At the center that I direct, the IMD World Competitiveness Center, we try to assess, among many other things, to what extent data contributes to the growth of a country, or to the prosperity or the competitiveness of a country. And what you find, and we have seen some statistics earlier, but what you find is that the more data-oriented economies become, the more prosperous they tend to become. But what is also very important is that country strategies, they incorporate data also as a source of value for society.
It all sounds really great,
yes.
But realistically, and we have an obsession in the UAE and Dubai of being #1. So I look at this rank and I look at those indicators and those indexes, but do we trust them? Do we really trust them? And if there's a certain mechanism around it, I would like to hear from you before I jump to the rest of the guests.
Yes. I think that for the UAE, even becoming #1 will never be enough.
I agree.
Because that's our fear, is that the day that the UAE becomes #1 in competitiveness, you will still wondering, how do you remain #1? So I know that I will never make you happy. So
no matter what we do.
But I think, having said that, I think that at the end of the day, data as a value driver, I think boils down to having the right data governance, data privacy, cybersecurity, infrastructure. So there are many factors that can be built by the government. Okay? At the end of the day, it has to influence people and companies. But actually, we can build from policies a digital economy.
I'll come to you, Jon, now. I mean, we had also a good chat. You're the CEO of Gallup. I was personally diagnosed, I don't know the word to be used, the 360. It was a bit scary, and they went through all the indexes and on an individual level and within our company. And you and I have what we call self-assurance. I don't know if that's a good thing, Jon. I'll keep that to you in a bit. But we spoke a lot about this, so about indicators. So I'm going to ask the same question. What is it to Jon? I mean, is data-driven behavior a myth? What's the ambiguity and skepticism around it? Because there are skeptical people. When they look at data and they think, do I really trust it? Is this data protected? So I'd like to hear with you so we can go into details in that.
Well, first of all, Nora, thank you. It's a great question. Data-driven decision-making is not a myth. The challenge, though, is leaders simply resort to their own behaviors and therefore don't listen to the data that exists in order to inform them. I'll give you an example, and many of you may be aware of this, but one of the things that Gallup does is we work with organizations in order to capture engagement. We want to know the emotional attachment that people have to the organizations in which they work. And so we go in and survey their employees and ask them whether or not they know what's expected of them at work, whether they have the opportunity to do what they do best, or whether they feel an attachment to the purpose and mission of the organization. When we get the results back, and oftentimes they're not good, the leaders just go back to whatever it was they were doing and nothing changes. Or number two, even worse, despite what the data tell them, they do something completely different. Here's an example. Oftentimes engagement is considered well-being at work. And actually, Danny Kahneman said as much on a podcast with Adam Grant. And so a lot of times when they hear well-being at work, they go, you know what we need to do? Get them yoga sessions for our employees. But what they don't realize is the single biggest stressor at work isn't whether or not you have yoga mats. The biggest stressor is whether or not people feel like they have the material and equipment they need in order to do their job effectively. And so as soon as the yoga mats hit the floor, you've now made your employees more miserable because you started making investments in the wrong thing. They need materials and equipment to do their job effectively, and you got them yoga mats. That is the very epitome of not listening. And so data-driven decision-making is not a myth. It's a flawed leader that doesn't use it to their advantage.
Jon, you said the word feel a couple of times, and I just want to know if feelings are actually measurable. So do we have a data or a ranking on how people actually feel? Because I'm not sure how that's done.
Well, one of the people who I think is one of the greatest thinkers of our time is Yuval Noah Harari. Of course, he wrote *Sapiens*, he wrote the book *Homo Deus*, and in the book *Homo Deus*, I think he says this brilliantly, is he says, we are emotional creatures. And what the point is that the decisions and actions we take in life, and this is why behavioral economics has become so influential, is because economics told us that human beings are rational agents. And what they forgot to do is walk down in their universities, walk down to the psychology department and check with them, because what people in the psych department knew is that human beings are not rational. We are emotional agents. And at Gallup's research, we find that 70% of the decisions that we make are based on our emotions, not on rational thought. And if you are sitting there thinking to yourself, it's most people, I'm actually most rational, I would actually go so far as to say you're actually the worst. And most of all, what you do is emotional. So the question now is it possible for us to capture our emotions? And it is. I mean, even through brain imagery, we can see what lights up in our brains based on the visuals that we see. And right now, Gallup is attempting to track this in over 140 countries every year. And we ask people if they experience a great deal of stress or if they experience a great deal of sadness. And I think what's most concerning is that for the past 10 years, we've seen a consistent rise across the entire world on the 5 negative emotions of anger, pain, stress, sadness, and worry. And it happened before the pandemic. So that has us very concerned, and I think leaders about it should be very worried, and I think it should have their attention.
I'll come back to that, rational or irrational. But Your Excellency Raja, Raja is the MD of Etihad Credit Insurance, board member of Zan Digital Bank. I had the pleasure for working with Raja for a certain period of time. Fintech has been your second name for quite a while. I had no idea what it meant 5 years ago. I pretended like I did. I had to Google it. But we know that Raja is one of the Emiratis we're very proud of, merging into the private sector and making us all very proud. Also a mother and a wife, so I'm definitely proud of Raja. And I will start with you, Raja, on digital transformation, especially something we hear a lot in the UAE. And how does that affect the infrastructure that Professor Arturo mentioned, and also data protection, because that's always a concern, especially with a culture like our culture. We do, and the gentleman from Snapchat mentioned that earlier, we do appreciate our privacy. So there's always a concern on data protection in that sense. And I want to know, does it make it or break it when it comes to, there's a thin line when it comes to that. I want to hear from you. And for a creative economy like us, is it difficult? Is it a turn off per se to have so much talk about that? Or does it assist in talent retention, becoming better in the future?
Thank you, Nora. It's my pleasure to be with you here today. And with regards to digital transformation, we all know how technology has really overtaken all economies, whether it's financial services, whether it's oil and gas. Technology companies has really made it at the top of the capital markets. And that has opened the path for transformation in the way we do business as we knew it for centuries and as we know it today. And we are just at the beginning, because the technology will enable this transformation, and this transformation will tap into data, as you mentioned. There is so many data sets, structured and unstructured, right and wrong. How do we make sure that we use the right data sets for the right transformation that we want to create for our industries and our economies? Now, with regards to regulation and data protection, it's absolutely very important because, as mentioned in the previous panel, opening data sets and integration between data sources is key to enabling that access to all of these services. And if it's done in an ungoverned way, it would actually risk all of this data and the privacy and the information all custodians hold of their customers. So it's really important to govern the access to data, but most importantly is open these data sources. If we look at, for example, the UAE, there's a lot of regulation that has been studied for years, and it's in effect now with regards to regulating access to data, protection of data, and use of data. Where is it stored? How is it transferred? Who has access to it? And what's the potential of hacking into this data sets? And once I was actually having a discussion with someone who was really looking at the concept of generating revenues of data. So what they were doing is that they're going to financial institutions and asking for financing against data sets that they own for their companies. So data is becoming really very valuable, given that it is the right data and governed in the right way. And it's really important to build on all the infrastructure, regulation, and technology to enable that. It also opens an opportunity for developing the equity and ethics within those data. How do you use it? Where do you use it? And what kind of assumptions and behaviors are built on that? Is it inclusive of minorities, of different genders, of different ethnic groups? Does it represent the whole economy or just one part of the economy that have access to contributing to these data?
Clearly, Raja, the question to the session's main rhetoric question, is it a myth or not, is clear. But where would Raja say, I'm skeptical when it comes to data collection? If any.
I'm skeptical if I don't know what the sources are. So, for example, when you run surveys, you don't know where this data is coming from. But when you run it inside the company and you know this data sets are coming from your employees within your organization, it's definitely true. Whether emotional or not, it reflects what's going on inside the company. And if it's negative, it means that's triggered by something else and gives you opportunity to drill down what are the feelings or issues that are triggering those kind of data sets.
By the way, Professor Arturo and John, if you disagree or agree, please jump in, because I would like it to be more of a conversation, so if you have anything to say.
I totally agree, actually, but this brings me to the previous panel, because you said something about sharing data and open our data set, which is fundamental to create value and to make it better. But actually I heard contradictory statements earlier on. I come from Europe, and in Europe we have had already GDPR for a few years. And one of the statements that I constantly hear is that GDPR is actually an obstacle for innovation. That's not true. That is not true. I mean, and not true in the sense that actually surveys have shown, for example, among institutions in Europe, that GDPR is an enabler of innovation, not an obstacle, because it clarifies and actually levels the playing field. And I give you another fundamental example. With open banking, because you've referred to the fintech, the biggest revolution in Europe when it comes to fintech has been open banking. And open banking is regulated and mandated in Europe, basically in a sense that banks are obliged to share their data. Unlike, for example, the United States or China. The approach to data by the European Union, and I point, as Spanish, you see? The approach by the European Union to data is that data belongs to the individual. The US approach is data belongs to Facebook. And the Chinese approach is data belongs to the party. So that approach actually creates trust. And in fact, going back to the same point, a survey among European banks has shown that European banks mostly accept open banking. That is, what I mean is that if you ask bankers, are you willing to share your data with your competitors? They say surprisingly, yes. And when you say, why is it the case? Well, because in fact, it promotes more innovation. And it allows them to compete with fintech disruptors, which in fact disrupt themselves.
Many tend not to use the word innovation with policy reformation and data in the same sentence. I mean, there are two teams. A team that says first innovative, then policy. And then another team who says, no, we need the regulations, but then I want you to be innovative. This is also something I would like to hear from your perspective. A lot of people talk about people who work in data by being, very to the book, very boring. But I've seen some of the work you've done, both of you and Her Excellency Raja. It's definitely not close to boring. How would you respond to what Professor Arturo said when he spoke about, you've related cultural sentiments towards developing policies. So somebody who sits in Europe is more open to having their bank statements, for public disclosure, where Americans prefer that to be on Facebook. Since you're American, maybe it'll be nice to respond at this point, or I'd push you to respond.
Well, let me address another thing about what data do you trust. And the reason I bring that one up is because I swear every time I give a presentation from Gallup's perspective, the audience turns into methodologists. And it's amazing, right? Because they go, well, how do you know that everyone that you're conducting surveys with, that this is true probability? I swear that they even want to know what a stratified sample looks like or something to that effect. But I often pose the question back to them that if you're as skeptical about the information that I'm sharing with you, are you equally as skeptical about all of the other information that you are consuming? And I say that because I will also say back to them, do you trust the unemployment figures that you consume? The room gets very quiet. And then I'll say back to them, how is that collected? I mean, you will have audiences that are very quiet. Because then I tell them that in the United States, when it says on that second Friday what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, that too is a survey of 60,000 Americans, they're very surprised. That it's done almost exactly the same way that Gallup is doing other surveys. Instead of asking somebody if they have a job, we do that too, and it highly correlates with what the BLS comes up with. We just ask, how do you feel? A lot of anger in your body? Do you feel sadness? And I think the other thing that's so incredible about surveys is it also shows the power of listening. Because when we go into the homes in Tanzania, of people living in Tanzania, into the homes of people who live in El Salvador, and ask them about how much pain they have or how they feel about the government, it is incredible what someone will share with you if you just sit with them. And this is a total stranger that has walked into your house, and they are ready to tell you about how their life is going. In fact, our interviews go so long, sometimes our respondents will bring tea to keep the conversation going. Think about that. So again, while we sit here and challenge these data, number one, make sure that we're challenging all of the data that we consume. That if you trust GDP so immensely, do you look behind it and say, how is this measured? And number two, remember that when it comes to surveys, this is really just listening at scale. And if you are a great if you're a great leader, I believe what the best leaders do is they listen. And so that's why I think surveys are sometimes some of the most important, not just listening to whether or not they have a job, but listening to how people feel.
I'd go to you, Raja, in regards, because we recently had a discussion about the new obsession with chat GDP. And I always think, especially when it comes in your field, when it comes to collecting data and etc., and then you've got the whole fear of AI. Is it a blessing, or is it something that would snatch off my job? So you had quite an opinion about that. So I would love for you to share it with the rest of us.
Thank you, Noura. But before I answer that, I want to just comment on the innovation
policy.
regulation.
Please do.
And this is a conversation that we probably had for over the last 5 years as we were transforming the financial services sector to enable fintech. And really, open banking is really important, but no one is willing to open it because you're not only opening to other financial institutions, you're opening to startups, you're opening to tools that will access this data and analyze it. But then what we like to do in the UAE and in most of the advanced hubs for innovation, progressive regulation. So there is the concept of sandboxes where you go and experiment with this innovation in a regulated environment that will showcase what could go wrong, and as it goes wrong, you get the chance to fix it or amend it along the way. And I think that's the safest way to achieve innovation. Innovation cannot happen on its own, independent of regulation and governance, because it will be out of control and it won't be adopted. But then back to artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, I think, we were having this conversation before. It's challenging us and it's pushing us outside of our comfort zone because AI is the future. And as you can see, ChatGPT will write for you emails, content. It is really taking away a lot of the current jobs that are being done by journalists, writers, etc. And there are the image generation like DALL-E and voice generation tools. So all of these technologies are coming. But what are they telling us? They're telling us to step out of our comfort zone and learn how to manage AI and build AI in a positive and ethical way to be inclusive and used in a good way. Because if you can automate all of that, whether it's responses or services as directed by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed, he said, I want to see how ChatGPT will serve me in my government. So that's really creating that disruption. But how can we manage this disruption to be positive, to be impactful, and how can we reimagine our businesses, our services, our education system as
of course.
we discussed?
From adaptability and speed, back to you, Professor Arturo. You spoke quite some in heavy interviews about, what is competitiveness? Because if I'm a regular from the mass and I hear the word competitiveness, I would think, does that mean compete? So are we in a race? So you've defined competitiveness quite well. So I would like you, if you could share it with the rest of us and the audience, and also speak about the importance of different pillars, whether it's adaptability, ChatGPT, are we adapting to this? Is it going to cause an issue or not? And does that affect any DDB, project you're working on?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, because I'm a missionary of competitiveness. Because clearly in the UAE this is very well understood, but in many other countries it's not. Let me start by saying that competitiveness is the objective of economic policy, and is very easily defined as the ability of a nation to generate prosperity for its people. And prosperity is obviously achieved through job creation, but also quality of life, technology, access to technology, sustainability, and certain values. What we do, and Jon's point was music to my ears, because we measure, you need to measure through surveys. You're totally correct. I mean, if you rely on the hard data, we had this discussion earlier with regulation and inclusion. If you look at hard data, very often, actually it gives you the wrong impression about the country. So what we do is we measure this ability of a nation to generate prosperity partly through a survey in which citizens and executives, mostly in a country, they actually tell you about behaviors and what they do and what they think. So not just about their perception, but also, how they behave. And I think that's also how you transform, you said earlier, emotions into actual.
And how you measure them.
Yes. So and because you cannot measure emotions directly, but you can actually measure the reaction to those emotions. I think you are the expert on that. But I think what we try to say is that, you cannot just look at the words in a regulation to assess how competitive a country is. You actually need to look at how people do behave. I will give you one very simple example. One of our studies that we do is on smart cities, and for many years the concept of a smart city was very much based on the technology, smart cameras and smart parking and so on. But then when you ask citizens, then you need to understand what their problems are. So you go to Paris and their main problem is traffic. And then you go to Boston, and their main issue is sustainability. So once you ask people, then you see how smart the city is, because if your problem is traffic, and then you just care too much about pollution, probably you are not going to make the city smart in that sense.
Since you mentioned sustainability and we're heading towards COP28, because you mentioned that, was it in the right place in the book or an interview? I'm not sure, because I just read the review. You spoke about one of the components in the data collection about sustainability. I'll ask this to you as an individual, and from data you can refer to. If I am a sustainable, quote unquote, individual, but I sit within an institute, a corporation that is not necessarily sustainable, or a government that is not necessarily sustainable, how does that work? Because you spoke about it tremendously regarding, this element and this pillar in specific.
Yeah. I think there are two important dimensions here. One is the dimension of personal values. As I come from a business school, so we educate executives and leaders on that front. I think your values have to be aligned with the values of the organization. Okay, and if this is not the case, you are either in the wrong place or you're actually not doing enough to change the values of the organization. And that's actually what leaders need to do. On the sustainability front, this is very important because at the end of the day, companies are about people. And I think you need to build a corporate culture around people's values. Okay? That's one dimension. The second dimension, and that's also my personal opinion and part of the work that we have been doing, we need to realize also that individual or corporate sustainability does not need necessarily to the world being a better place. That's a controversial statement. That is, if you think about that, as companies become more sustainable, they are creating additional problems that make the world less sustainable. Example, when it comes to inclusion and inequality, if my company becomes more sustainable, possibly I'm actually creating income inequalities at the national level or even at the international level. When you look at data, for example, data is creating a massive gap between data-driven economies and not data-driven economies. So essentially, we need to also think about to what extent individual and corporate sustainability leads to a better world, because that's not clear to me yet.
Great. Jon, we spoke also about your book, The Blind Spot, and I quickly skimmed through it, and there's a lot about what you just mentioned earlier about the unhappiness rather than the happiness indicator. We're familiar with happiness because we're such a bubbly and positive nation, but it'll be nice to know not the right pillars or components when it comes to that, but we spoke about mistakes. So I would like to hear some of that and what was written in the book regarding some of the mistakes. We had a chat earlier with some of the ladies from the team, and as women, they've been heading a delegation of all women, and at that specific place, the index said that we rank very low. I cannot quote exactly the number, but very low in that sense. So am I skeptical about specific data collection and indexes? Maybe, but you explained that there's a way to do certain things and some things might not have been marked correctly.
Well, the index that you're referring to where the UAE did not perform well, as I understand it, is the Doing Business Index from the World Bank, not Gallup's indicators on happiness. But when it comes to happiness, I think one of the challenges is the very word happiness. Because many of you have probably heard about the World Happiness Report, which is supposed to represent the happiest people in the world. The challenge, though, is that happiness has two definitions. And the first definition is this sort of ephemeral, or I guess as the American Fed would say, a transitory feeling, whereas there's this other kind of interpretation, which is contentment. And ultimately what Gallup is measuring in this World Happiness Report, we're hidden in the footnote on it, it's more of a measure of contentment. People who rate their lives high are the most content people in the world. It's why Norway and Denmark rate the highest in the world, and Haiti, Democratic Republic of Congo, they rate their lives the worst. This is also why if you go on the streets of Copenhagen or Helsinki and say, hey, you ranked as the happiest country in the world, how do you feel about that? They'll go, we're not the happiest country in the world. In fact, one minister said, if we're the happiest country in the world, then I feel horrible for all the other countries in the world. And so one of the aspects is contentment, and we're trying to capture these sort of two aspects of the human mind. One is the self-narrating mind, and the other one is the experiencing mind, and both overrule each other at odd times. Your self-narrating mind will say, you know what, it's New Year's and I'm going to make a pledge that I'm going to lose weight this year and I'm going to eat healthy. But then the experiencing mind on Friday night goes, I can cheat, I'm going to order a pizza. And so this is the combat that every human mind has, and what we're trying to do is take these very difficult concepts of the human mind and take them to scale to understand what's happening in communities, organizations, and also in countries. And as I had mentioned earlier, that's where we see this global rise of the experiential mind, because we're all experiencing more stress, sadness, anger, pain, and worry. And I think it comes down to three things. Number one is loneliness. We went and asked people, how many people do you spend quality time with over a 2-week period of time? We had really popular people like Nora who said 100. We had other people who said a dozen, but we had another group of people who said none. We found that 6% of all adults, which represents 330 million people around the world do not spend quality time with anyone. This includes a woman at about this time last year in Italy. Security actually was going around in this town in Italy knocking on doors because they wanted to warn people about threatening winds. Nobody answered, so they forcibly went in and they found out she had passed away. That wasn't the scary part. She had been dead for 2 years and no one knew. But 330 million people around the world live just like her, where they don't have anyone that they have meaningful connection with. In fact, 20% of all adults don't have anyone that they can look to when there are times when things get tough. And that's a problem from social well-being. The other one is global hunger. One of the challenges is most people live in countries where obesity is the single biggest challenge. But although the fact that the world has been winning the war against the global hunger crisis, it changed at around 2014 and it started to increase. This is a project that Gallup does with FAO, and people are experiencing more debilitating hunger. And the last one is, for whatever reason, as much as people say that they listen, the workplace is killing us. And we are closer to colonizing Mars than we are to fixing the global workplace because we find that 80% of workers...
We're definitely closer to Mars,
what?
for sure.
have either quietly or loudly quit. They're miserable at work. And remember, the only thing we do other than sleep in life where we spend more time is work. There's one estimate where it's 110,000 hours of our life, which is the equivalent of 13 straight years. So if you are miserable for all those, think about what it means for the rest of your life. So those three things are causing a great deal of misery that's increasing in the world, and it was increasing far before the pandemic.
You want to interject? I know, please go ahead.
So I remember maybe 5 years ago in this very same conference, we had the top representatives from the government from Bhutan. And I remember having this discussion. So I have a question for you. So suppose you were
Yeah.
This is a question that I have received very often. You know, happiness should be also a goal of policies. So suppose that you are a minister of happiness in the US. So how would you implement happiness? So which policies would you implement to increase people's happiness? I mean, I agree with you that it can be measured. And so that now, what would you do?
If you want a silver bullet to a great life, it's a great job. And so I think every leader in the world needs to make their number one agenda of policy creating great jobs. Now, what is a great job? It's not just that you have a solid paycheck and reliable work. It's also that you have an emotional attachment to work. Now, the challenge is we confuse or conflate this item of happiness. I think one of the greatest lies that's ever been propagated within workplaces, find a job that you love and you'll never work a day again in your life. It's not true. If you're trying to change the world, do not imagine that there will be a total absence of stress. If you're trying to change the world, don't imagine that there will be a total absence of pain. I mean, the very definition of work, if you look it up, it says that it is the exertion of energy in order to accomplish a result. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the single biggest things leaders need to work on, and this is a place that maybe the World Economic should be Forum, or even here that we should be talking about because it does bring together private and public sector leaders, is the very drive to create great jobs. Because if we spend 110,000 hours, I did the lower bound estimate, it's 83,000 hours of our lives. If we can fix that, we will fix the pain that exists in humanity today.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly. If when you do that, let me know. I'll work for you. Yeah. Raja, we spoke also about, okay, I'll go back to it. You said progressive innovation, because I'm going to quote you on this, and it's not copyrighted. I'll use it on the long run. So you spoke about that, but you also spoke about policy reformation in the UAE in specific and in Dubai maybe. What are some of the recent, you would think, policy changes that could assist us, I mean, from the data you've collected, that could assist us in developing in specific areas, whether it was from an investment perspective or a touristic perspective, or talent retention, power shifts, etc.?
So there is continuous development in the policies and regulations in the UAE, and every day we receive a new directive for either new regulations in financial services or changes in work visas or really remote working. And we're having a chat with Professor Arturo about how the whole federal and local regulations has been changed to retain talent in the UAE, not only to attract investments or attract businesses, but the people that work for those investments and businesses needs also a comfortable place to live in, where they feel safe, they feel secure, they enjoy their life. They have the social part of their life in addition to a great job that gives them that satisfaction. So we've seen a lot of changes in the visa structure, whether we have the investor's visa, where people can come and buy property, get access to bank accounts, government services, etc., all the way to remote working visas, where you will enable that whole digital nomads and work from home population to experience Dubai and the UAE and other countries without really having to go to work on a daily basis. And I know we had different views on this one because
two or not two remote working.
Exactly. And I mentioned I actually met a Kuwaiti lady in Mexico. And I said, what do you do? And she said that she's a digital nomad. And by that time, I wasn't really sure what digital nomads do. But she said, I want to experience the world while still having a great job where I can connect from anywhere, anytime. And my employers know that. And that gives her that whole fulfillment on her social and cultural curiosity aspects.
Okay, we'll go back to DDBs, but also when it comes to work-life balance or gender, I'll expose that. So we had a chat. So Raja has 2 sons, and again, back to measuring feelings versus actually looking at data and making life decisions upon that. So you've got 2 different personalities, obviously. And would you do a kind of a calculated, data-driven behavior when it comes to decision whether to place your own children in specific schools or put them in specific universities or push them towards? So, and I'm not saying answer the question of DDB, is it a myth or not, or push you towards skepticism, but would you base that on data collection that you would do as a mother for your own children?
50%. And then
But
I'll
why?
follow my intuition. Because it's contextual. You cannot really take a decision 100% knowing that the outcome is going to come in a certain way. And we've experienced this many times in our own lives. Yes, you give them the options and you collect all the data on the best probability for Ali to get accepted in NYU, for example. But he might just go in and realize that this is not for me and I don't want to do this. So regardless of how much data collection you do, when it's a new experience, I think it takes its own way of shaping.
And I always also take the opportunity when I have a woman on my panel to ask you about gender balance in the UAE or in Dubai, experiences, challenges, progression, and specifically that we spoke about, the hybrid between, or the availability of remote working versus, when we used to just only punch in and out from offices.
I don't want to say I am lucky, but really the UAE has naturally created this ecosystem of empowerment and enablement for women.
To be honest, Raja, I stopped apologizing to everyone else. We are lucky.
Exactly, but not to be ignorant, people from other countries don't understand how we got there, because
Absolutely.
I was asked by a couple of my contacts in the US to come and talk about the challenges I face in my career as a woman. And I said, I haven't. And said, how come? Equal pay, financial services, technology, numbers. And I was like, I was supported from the beginning, from my father all the way to my leaders in the organizations where I worked, even till I decided to leave. For example, I was with the DIFC for a very long time. Till the time I decided to move on from there, I got the support, and I was asked if I ever wanted to change my mind and come back, I have a place there. So the guidance support is really inspired from the roots of this country, from the leaders, the way they deal within their own families. We see His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed with his daughter or grandchildren. It's inclusive culture that inspires all of us to operate in this way. And with the digital transformation has enabled more women to access the workforce, or also to networking and events where they were probably shy before, but with technology and LinkedIn, you can be part of virtual events, you can comment on certain topics that really enables you to connect to the right networks that serve your career.
Professor Arturo, we'll go back to specifically talking about talent retention and power shifts. I would love to hear an example, because we spoke in general, but if you've got a specific case study or an example on prior or after or post to data collection, have we seen that those reports can actually persuade, specific nations to shift power or high level decisions, when it comes to talent retention?
So talent, I think talent attraction the concept is changing significantly, because if you think about what we see with the new generation, with the digital nomads and the ability to work from home, so in the past, talent attraction means that I bring someone to my country to work for one of my companies, and then I'm importing skills. Now it is changing, because today a company can hire someone working abroad that has been educated in the best university in the world. Today I can hire from my company in Switzerland a graduate from MIT that is living in Barcelona, for example. And this means that one of the main drivers of talent attraction in the past, that was the quality of the education system, is not anymore relevant. What I mean is that if your education is very poor and very weak, then you attract talent from abroad. And actually, there are many countries that have overcome the quality of their education system by bringing talent from abroad. Now, this is not the case anymore. I think the most important aspect of talent attraction, and actually I've recently published an academic article about that, I go back to Jon's point. The main attractor of talent today factor is quality of life. So you need to preserve in your country a good quality of life, meaning safety, infrastructure, good education, like the ability to fulfill your task.
The true indicator of happiness that we just had a chat about.
Because at the end of the day, that you are going to import talent in the UAE only as long as people can have happy lives. Okay? And in fact, when it comes to executives, it is interesting to see, and we prove that, we prove that, for an academic to say we prove that, but we actually find that, for example, income is not a driver. That is, once you control for quality of life, income, that is the ability to move to a different country because you are going to make more money, is not necessarily a talent of attraction.
We'll wrap up on a happy note.